Tonight in the studio we've got Marius Oosthuizen, who is the Head Program Director for the GIBS Centre for the Future of Business in South Africa. Marius is an expert in the world of foresight and future studies, and he'll be sharing with us some of his views about managing in an increasingly complex environment. In 1991, I think, Peter Schwartz wrote the seminal book in future studies, The Art of the Long View. Now, since then, the world has changed many a times. That begs the question, is future studies still a relevant study and exercise?
You know, it's interesting. After some of the changes the world went through, the economic meltdown more recently, the burst of the IT bubble a few years ago, they recognized that the future is too unpredictable. And so the purpose of future studies is not so much predicting a singular future, but to understand what the alternative scenarios may be that an organization or a country or a nation faces. And so there's actually a re-emergence of future studies with this bit of a different perspective in trying to prepare organizations to have resilience as opposed to predicting the future.
A lot of big corporates will have a strategy division or even some futures or foresights division. How do you institutionalize foresight into an organization? Let's say a medium-sized organization.
Right. So strategy is very popular. Everyone talks about the company strategy, yet when you go and visit the company, it's really a file with a big word on it saying strategy, and no one really reads the file very often. And so we want to go beyond strategy development. That's very important, but we want to take the strategy and make it a living document. And so institutionalized activities such as environmental scanning, where managers in their particular domain are looking at the environment around them, and they're looking at the environment and what's happening in the environment with very specific lens, trying to understand what are the changes, what's driving those changes, and then bring into the organization mechanisms where that feedback can be brought into the intelligence within the organization. So you would maybe add a line item on an agenda for a board meeting where an individual who doesn't typically talk about the future of the company would be given a platform to think about the future along with the decision makers.
If we look at what's happening now, we've got just at the World Economic Forum in Davos, lots of issues being discussed and lots of foresight in terms of what's being discussed there. Just what are some of the things and trends that we might look forward to from a strategic and foresight perspective?
Well, we're in an interesting time as the globe. We've had this rise of globalization, we've had the internationalization of markets and products, and then we had the meltdown. So as the globe and businesses across the globe, we're looking at this and asking ourselves, do we want to globalize increasingly and to the extent that we are? And so we might see in certain areas some countries taking a bit more of a protectionist stance, specifically in areas where they feel that they can compete. So you might have more protection of agriculture in some places. You might find companies looking to benefit from the increased complexity and connectivity of the globe, while at the same time trying to protect themselves in other areas. And so the key for nations like South Africa or other African countries would be to ask yourself, where do we compete? How do we position ourselves within this global system in a way that we can compete better than our neighbor can? Or even if you look at the rise of regionalism, how do we compete as a bloc? So how do we compete as West Africa or SADC for that matter?
One of the things about foresight studies is obviously that we don't only look towards the future, but we also take some learnings from the past. Now, if we were to look at the last 20 years, what are some of the things that popped up that we maybe could have anticipated had we applied some of your foresight analysis and methodology?
Well, I think on the two sides of it. On the financial side, certainly at the root of the economic slowdown or the recession was the mismanagement of funds or the very risky behavior by fund managers, bankers, etc. And I think that's a symptom of the kind of capitalism we've practiced for a number of decades. So I think if there's a lesson on that side, it is that we as business leaders need to think very carefully about the ethical dimension of how we do business and the long-term implications of that and the unintended consequences of if we fail to be ethical in how we do business. And that ties, of course, to the issue of environmental change and climate change in particular. It's another function of being ethical and understanding our sustainability responsibility, not just towards human beings, but also towards the environment. So I think that's a major change we need to take on board. You
come from an interdisciplinary function or academic side, which is foresight studies. Now, a lot of how our managers in today's world come into management is from an accounting, a legal, or a marketing perspective. How do we ensure that the future's thinking is inculcated across these diverse strands as a manager?
I think in your question you've put your finger on the issue, and that is that in the future where we look at a world that is increasingly connected, increasingly global, increasingly divergent, managers need to be able to think across different disciplines. They need to be able to see the whole. They need to be able to see the parts within the whole. So management historically was about taking strategy through to implementation. The new manager in the new world will need to take strategy and implement it in diverse contexts. I mean, you might have an African company that is owned by a Chinese owner that is doing business with another multinational from somewhere in Europe. And so as a manager, you need to be able to operate across those contexts. And that requires a unique set of skills that will be what we would classify as making an individual future ready.
You touch on a very interesting point, the Africa dimension. 20 years ago, The Economist had on their cover the forgotten continent. 20 years later, it's a land of opportunity. Where are we going with as a continent?
Well, it's interesting. Africa finds itself in between two mega trends. The one is a domestic trend on the continent where Africans themselves are awakening to the possibilities that lie within them. And so you're seeing African ingenuity, African economies starting to self-develop, education is rising on the continent, healthcare is rising. At the same time, you've got the external trend from an international point of view where the likes of China, America are beginning to compete for Africa, and particularly the natural resources in Africa, as well as the human resources. You have more than 1 billion people in Africa, many of them still young. And so between those two mega trends, Africa finds itself in a very favorable position. Obviously, the future is never certain. And so the question will be, how does Africa position itself? How does it navigate the challenges of development? Are we going to create a super rich elite with a large populace that are still poor? Are we going to find a middle way where we can uplift the population and educate them and give them jobs and see an inclusive Africa?
Taking into account some of the regional bodies, the SADCs of the world and the African Union, is there a role for futures to play in there?
Absolutely. Obviously, on a regional level, sort of the macro picture, we need to integrate. We need to talk to each other. We need to understand our mutual developmental goals. But that translates down to the micro level where we need to have a formalization of standard labor policies. We need to open our borders. We need to do the basic things on the ground that will make us work more efficiently as an economy within the region, not just within countries.
In closing, one last question. We're at the start of a new year. Locally, there's a lot happening. There's an election around the corner. What are your top 5 predictions of things that will move the world this year?
It's clear that the political elites are trying to be centrist in their economic policy, which is what we need as a country. But at the same time, they're trying to accommodate the left that is increasingly frustrated. So I think we're going to see loud voices on the left, the likes of the EFF, the likes of NUMSA and others trying to lobby for position. I think economically, business is going to stand back and watch to see what the story is about before they make any major decisions. It's not a great story from that point of view in that it will stifle investment. I think the same can be said of foreign direct investment, which will probably hang back. We will at the same time see some new innovations coming from South African leaders. We've seen this over the years. We have great talent in this country and great innovation, and that will continue to happen. And then I think socially, we probably will see some more unfortunate incidences around service protests in the sense that the police and other structures will try and handle these very difficult situations. And I think as a country, we have some real challenges ahead of us.
Certainly a lot to think about in a very changing and complex world. And thank you very much, Marius.
Thank you.